You have completed the implementation sequence. The fiscal residency transfer is on record. The banking infrastructure is operational. The holding structure is domiciled. And for a moment, it feels as though the work is done. It is not. In fact, the most consequential phase of the sovereign shelter strategy begins the morning after activation, what practitioners call the day two reality. This is the phase where architecture either holds or fractures, where jurisdictions either validate or challenge, where the evidentiary standard is tested, not in theory, but in practice. Episodes 1 through 4 of this series built the intellectual and operational foundation, from jurisdictional selection to legal scaffolding to the implementation sequence itself. This episode completes the picture. We are moving from construction to maintenance, from activation to operational sustainability, from execution to compliance continuity. If you have followed this series from the beginning, this is the episode that closes the loop. If you are arriving here for the first time, understand this: building a sovereign shelter is a single event. Sustaining it is a discipline. In episode 4, we introduced the institutional checklist, the 12-point operational framework that governs the activation window. Let us now revisit that checklist through the lens of ongoing management, because every item on that checklist is not a one-time action, it is a recurring obligation. Fiscal residency documentation must be refreshed annually in most target jurisdictions. The Common Reporting Standard imposes exchange cycles that do not pause. Substance requirements, the physical presence, the local directorship, the genuine economic activity must be demonstrably maintained, not merely established. The banking relationships must be actively managed, not passively held. And the tax position in the origin jurisdiction must be continuously monitored for unrealized capital gains events that could trigger retroactive liability. The institutional checklist is not a checklist you complete, it is a checklist you operate. Advisory offices that treat activation as a finish line routinely produce structures that collapse within 18 to 36 months, precisely because they conflate execution with sustainability. The distinction matters enormously. Execution is a project. Sustainability is a system. Compliance continuity is the operational doctrine that governs day 2 and every day thereafter. It is the systematic, scheduled, evidentiary management of every regulatory obligation attached to the sovereign shelter structure. Let us be precise about what this means. It begins with information exchange architecture, understanding exactly which common reporting standard triggers apply to your structure, which financial institutions are obligated to report, and which jurisdictions are receiving that data. The CRS is not passive, it is a live bilateral network that produces annual data transfers between 115 plus signatory jurisdictions. Your structure exists inside that network. The question is not whether it will be seen, it is whether what is seen is compliant. From there, compliance continuity extends to local substance management, ensuring that the economic activity attributed to the target jurisdiction is not merely on paper, but is auditable. Lease agreements, local payroll, board minutes, professional service engagements. Each of these elements constitutes an evidentiary layer that must be contemporaneous, consistent, and independently verifiable. And finally, compliance continuity requires a forward-looking audit readiness posture, maintaining documentation as though an inquiry could arrive at any time, because in the modern regulatory environment, it can. Here is the structural fact that separates durable architecture from regulatory exposure. Economic substance is no longer a best practice. It is the evidentiary standard. Asset rationalization is the process of aligning the composition of the asset base with the regulatory and tax profile of the target jurisdiction. This is the work that most implementation-focused advisors do not address, because it requires an ongoing dynamic assessment of how specific asset classes interact with the host jurisdiction's domestic tax code, its bilateral treaty network, and its CRS reporting obligations. Consider a straightforward example. A client who relocates fiscal residency to a territorial tax jurisdiction may hold a portfolio of globally distributed real assets, property, operating equity, private credit positions, and listed securities across multiple domiciles. Each of those positions generates its own reporting trail. Each interacts differently with the new jurisdiction's treaty network. Some positions are rationalized by holding them through a jurisdictionally appropriate vehicle. Others require restructuring because the cost of holding them in their current form exceeds the tax efficiency they were originally intended to provide. Asset rationalization is not liquidation, it is alignment. The process begins with a full portfolio audit conducted through the lens of the target jurisdiction's regulatory profile. It continues with a structured sequencing plan that minimizes unrealized capital gains exposure during the transition. And it concludes with a rationalized asset base that is optimized for the new jurisdictional environment, not the old one. This is the difference between a structure that is technically compliant and one that is operationally efficient. The bilateral tax treaty network is not background context. It is operational infrastructure. A jurisdiction that maintains a robust treaty network, 40, 60, 80 bilateral agreements, provides structural access to reduce withholding rates, dispute resolution mechanisms, and capital gains exemption frameworks that fundamentally alter the economics of holding certain asset classes. The advisory implication is precise. Fiscal residency selection at the implementation phase must be evaluated not only for its domestic tax profile, but for the quality and coverage of its treaty network relative to the client's specific asset base. This is why the same target jurisdiction can be the optimal choice for one client and a structurally poor choice for another. A private equity investor with concentrated exposure to European operating companies requires a different treaty analysis than a real estate family with assets distributed across Southeast Asian markets. Asset rationalization and treaty network optimization are not sequential processes. They are concurrent disciplines. The rationalized asset base and the jurisdictional treaty coverage must be designed together because the common reporting standard and unrealized capital gains exposure operate at the intersection of both. Advisors who sequence these decisions independently, completing the fiscal residency transfer before conducting the treaty analysis, consistently produce suboptimal structures that require costly reconstruction within 3 to 5 years. The OECD's base, erosion, and profit shifting framework, now in its second iteration with a third generation of Pillar 2 implementation actively in progress, is not a static regulatory environment. It is an evolving global architecture designed specifically to close the gaps that sovereign shelters have historically occupied. Understanding this is not cause for alarm. It is cause for deliberate structural design. Architectural adaptability is the capacity of the sovereign shelter structure to absorb future regulatory changes without requiring full reconstruction. It is engineered at the design stage, not retrofitted after the fact. The jurisdictions with the highest long-term structural durability are those that participated in the BEPS framework as rule makers rather than rule takers. They are jurisdictions with transparent, codified substance requirements, established CRS compliance infrastructure, and domestic tax codes that have already internalized the Pillar 2 global minimum tax framework. The global minimum effective tax rate of 15%, now operational across the majority of OECD member states, has materially narrowed the range of viable jurisdictions. But it has not eliminated the architecture, it has refined it. Jurisdictions that combine territorial or participation exemption regimes with robust treaty networks and low administrative friction remain structurally defensible, precisely because they were designed for the post-BEPS environment. Compliance continuity and architectural adaptability are not independent disciplines. They are the same doctrine operating at different time horizons. One manages today's obligations, the other anticipates tomorrow's. The gap in this market is not informational. Every piece of regulatory data discussed in this series is publicly available to any tax attorney or compliance officer with access to the OECD's published guidance. The gap is structural. It is the absence of a single coordinated advisory mandate that encompasses jurisdictional selection, legal architecture, implementation sequencing, compliance continuity, asset rationalization, and architectural adaptability simultaneously across the full asset base with accountability for the outcome. Most clients who arrive at a private advisory consultation have already engaged 3 to 5 separate advisors: a tax attorney, a corporate structuring firm, a banking relationship, a compliance consultant, none of whom are speaking to each other. The result is a structure that is technically assembled, but operationally fragmented. If this series has clarified the architecture, the next step is the advisory conversation. A private consultation structured around your specific jurisdictional profile, your asset base, your timeline, and your evidentiary standard. The link is in the description. That conversation does not begin with products. It begins with the structure and where yours currently stands.
Join our community of informed investors to stay ahead. This data is for education and is not financial advice. Always consult a professional before investing. To speak with one of our specialists, click the link in the description. I'll see you in the next report.